The parents go along with this because they're told their child will kill themselves otherwise. So that's the absolutely crucial lie at the middle of all of this. There is actually not any evidence that children who are gender dysphoric are any more prone to suicidal thinking or suicidal action than other children who are distressed in similar ways. So even if you had this hypothetical male body with a female brain in it, you can't give that person a female body. You just can't do it. It'd be kinder to say, this is not possible. And now we've got this radical subjectivity that's like a sort of universal acid just eating through everything. And there's no stopping point for it. Once you start to say that things can't be categorised, that nothing can be categorised, not even this attempt to not categorise.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate your time. And for those who don't know you, can you introduce yourself and explain your academic background and your career path?
Sure, my name's Helen Joyce, and a long time ago I was an academic. I have a PhD in mathematics, but I ended up going into journalism, and I worked at The Economist from 2005 to just very recently, beginning of 2023. And about 5 years ago, I realised just by chance that this thing that I call gender identity ideology was spreading very fast through institutions, through schools, through healthcare, and that it was having malign effects. And I ended up writing a book about it, which came out in 2021, called Trans, When Ideology Meets Reality. And that changed my life, and that's why I've stepped away from The Economist. And although I still do journalism, I regard myself more now as an advocate for sex-based rights.
Great. What got you interested in that topic in the first place, enough to leave your job and write a book about it?
Well, the first thing that bothered me about it was a sort of circular definition at its heart. So this is the idea that what makes people men or women or boys or girls isn't just what they're born. You know, just the fact that we're a mammalian species and we come in male and female. It's what people feel about themselves and say about themselves. And that leads us to this slogan that we've probably all heard by now, which is trans women are women. And that in mathematical terms is a circular definition. It's a definition that contains within it the word that you're trying to define, so it doesn't define anything. And that really bothered me as someone who had studied mathematics. But I didn't, I thought all these intelligent people were not noticing this problem, so I was missing something, and it just bothered me for about a year. And then I realised that something that I had thought was kind of a, let's be kind, it's a bit of a fiction, we don't really mean it. They aren't going to seriously say that men who think they're women should be allowed into spaces that are for women only. And then I realised they did mean it. And that meant a lot for women's rights, it meant a lot for what we're teaching children, and it meant a lot for healthcare. And that was when I really became concerned, when I realised that children are being told lies about identity, about their physiology, about their futures and their development, and that those lies can have lifelong consequences. And when I met detransitioners for the first time, that's people who had identified as trans, had done some medical treatments and then had realised it was all a mistake, that was when I thought, well, OK, I've got to write a book about this. And ultimately that led to me leaving my job because I just was totally consumed by the fact that this thing was happening and I needed to tell people about it.
Yeah, it seems to be a life-deranging problem for many different groups of people. So it's both interesting and unfortunate. And what interests me the most about it certainly is taking away women's rights, but also just what it does to children. I mean, it's just ghastly. And sometimes, the more I read about this and learn about it, I feel like I'm peering into some kind of alternate universe where somehow this makes sense. It feels so strange.
I still feel like that. What people tend to say is that they fell down the rabbit hole. Like when you talk to someone about this, at some point they'll say, I fell down the rabbit hole. And for me, that was, I can remember the day, I couldn't tell you the date, but it was in 2018. And I went into work early because it was a busy day. And I was talking to a colleague. I was the finance editor of The Economist at the time. This was not my day job. And I found one of my colleagues and I said to him, you are not going to believe what I've just read. They seriously think that if you're male and you identify as a woman, but you're, a heterosexual man, that makes you a lesbian woman, and lesbians who aren't willing to sleep with you are bigots. And the pair of us looked at each other and went like, holy fuck, are these people out of their minds? But yes, to such an extent they believe this, that the boss of Stonewall, which is the organisation here in the UK that was set up to campaign for lesbian and gay rights, the boss of that, who is a lesbian woman herself, Nancy Kelly, says that lesbians who will not sleep with trans women, by principle I mean, not some specific trans woman, a trans woman, remember, is a man who identifies as a woman, that lesbian is a sexual racist.
A sexual racist.
A sexual racist. So she's saying that your sexual orientation, I'm a heterosexual woman, I will not sleep with a woman. It's just not going to happen. That makes me, if that woman identifies as a man, the equivalent of somebody who says, I will not sleep with someone black.
Bizarre. That's the first time I've heard that, actually, sexual racist. I'll have to remember that one. What has been the reception to trans, and have you taken your book, and have you taken any flack for it? I assume you have. Have you gotten any death threats or anything serious?
I just block and mute on Twitter. So, it's possible that there are people shouting into the void all sorts of horrible things, but I don't see it. I don't care what people say about me. Absolutely, I just don't care. And I think that any grown-ups who care what somebody is saying about you, when what you were saying is about protecting children, then those grown-ups need to grow the fuck up, because grown-ups need to stand up and not be bullied into being silent when children's welfare is at risk. Mostly the reception has been much better than I thought. It was difficult to get it published. It was difficult to get everything around it done. It was, for example, hard to record an audiobook. Nobody wanted to buy the audiobook rights. There have been some negative reviews, which of course is fine, but actually most of the reviews have been excellent. It's more that there are places that it hasn't appeared, for example, in my home country, Ireland. I've never been mentioned, for example, in the Irish Times. And if you're Irish, you know that an Irish person goes abroad and sneezes, and we boast about it endlessly in our local press. So, that is not standard. Like, normally if somebody had a book out that was a top 10 book in the Times and was listed as a book of the year by the Spectator and other media in Britain, I would just endlessly be on the local national television and in the Irish Times. But no, they don't talk about me at all.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's unfortunate that no one's mentioned you here. It seems rather absurd.
I should say it's not that they're not mentioning me that bothers me. It's that they're not talking about this. There's a code of omerta. So Ireland has introduced gender self-ID. So you can change your birth cert here on demand to say whichever sex you prefer. It's free. You can do it online. You just send off your birth cert, and 6 weeks later you'll get back a new birth cert with a falsified sex on it. And that means for all purposes. So there are rapists in women's jails here at the moment in Ireland. But you're not meant to talk about this. It's bigoted to talk about it. So, yeah, it's not that I want my name in the paper. It's that I want Ireland to wake up to what it's done.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's totally fair. So it's so fascinating that it's socially acceptable and apparently legally acceptable to just declare that you're a woman when you're a man, or vice versa, and then supposedly, get access to those rights. And yet people can't do this with race, right? And it's completely shunned, except for the pretendians. I don't know if you know of that phenomenon, but people will pretend to be Native American.
Oh, right.
It's the only exception. But other than that, which is weird. But if someone said, like Rachel Dolezal, or however you pronounce her name.
It's Dolezal.
Dolezal, sorry. So why is that? Why can we do this with sex, which is completely immutable, very clear boundaries, but not race?
So you have to understand that this ideology is being pumped out from America. Like, bits of it have come, for example, from French postmodernism, but this in its entirety was cooked up on American campuses in the 1990s and 2000s. And so it's very much inflected by American racial politics, which are very specific and different from elsewhere. So America has always had this idea that, one drop of black blood makes you black. I lived in Brazil for many years, or for about 4 years as a foreign correspondent, and that isn't how race is conceived of in Brazil. It's seen as much more of a spectrum. So, two people for the same parents may regard themselves as different races if their skin colours are different in Brazil. And of course, America's racial history is very, very fraught and miserable. So that has grown up into something that we tend to call critical race theory now, in which, honestly, it looks from an outside perspective as if whiteness is original sin. And you can't allow people to identify out of their original sin. You can't allow white people to identify out of whiteness, because whiteness is something you're meant to be atoning for and, doing the work all of your life. So that's sort of over here. And then over here is a totally different intellectual tradition, which came up from queer theory. And in queer theory, the central idea is that categories are coercive and controlling and authoritarian and in themselves harmful, and that it is good to blur boundaries and good to invert hierarchies. And there's a sort of 50-year history of people saying, you think that this thing followed that thing, well, actually the other way around. Like idiotic examples like that speech is a form of writing, rather than thinking, well, writing followed on from speech. And in that intellectual tradition, when you look at sexism, or you look at what you might call the patriarchy, not a word I'm very fond of, but you just look at the way that women have been oppressed, which is just a fact, that oppression is taken to follow from the categorization of men and women. And I mean, I would say that there just really are men and women. We're mammals, and there were, males and females literally hundreds of millions of years before there was language. And that then we say, well, okay, the female of the species has been oppressed. Let's stop doing that as best we can in this imperfect world. But they would say that the categorization of male and female is central to the problem of the oppression. And I mean, these two things are not consistent, the way that you treat race and the way that you treat sex in this worldview. But consistency is not the central goal or the central value of these people.
I've noticed. Yeah. And I want to come back to queer theory because it's fascinating to me, and I just read an introduction to queer theory, which gave me a headache. But
well done, you.
Oh God, it was one of the worst things. I think queer theory is it's one of the biggest wastes of mediocre intellect in the history of mankind.
Yeah, they should all be just off doing something useful.
Yeah, for sure. All the theorizing is just so useless. Yeah. But if you were to give a brief summary of what it is that you call gender identity ideology, what would that be?
The sort of simple idea that these words male, female, man, woman, girl, boy don't refer to immutable biology, which is an evolved category, but refer to feelings and statements about feelings, specifically feelings about identity. So just to give a little brief primer, these words male and female are as fundamental in biology as words like atom and gravity and electron and, positive and negative charge are in physics. So male and female are evolved categories, and what they mean is reproductive strategies. Male is everything that evolved to support the production of what are called small motile gametes in humans and other animals, that's sperm. And female is everything that evolved to support the production of large immotile gametes in humans, that's called eggs. And that's it. Some animals, famously clownfish, can actually change sex. Some animals have both male and female parts. They're hermaphrodites, like worms. But all mammals have all the male parts in one group of individuals and all the female parts in another group of individuals. So I have no male characteristics, and a man has no female characteristics, and we can't change sex. No mammal can. And that's just basically a fundamental fact. It's an evolved fact about the species that we are. So it's so strange to think that this is something that you could co-opt to being something about identity. But that's what they think. They think that the biology either isn't real or is unimportant, and that what you say about yourself is the cardinal fact. And the thing is, you sort of feel like saying, well, okay, fine, say what you like. It doesn't bother me if somebody says, that they're bisexual, or if they say they're Jewish, or if they say they're, Irish. Like, those may or may not be true, but it doesn't bother me. But with sex, it does matter, because there are a limited but important number of situations where you do need to know the sex of other people, and you act on it too. Like, a woman isn't going to go into a confined space alone with a male person when she might with a female person. She's not going to want to get naked in a changing room if there's any male person there. She may ask for a female health or care attendant. And certain groups of women are more vulnerable than others. They might be rape victims who are traumatised by the presence of men. And that's not saying that all men are rapists, it's just saying that trauma is a real thing. We segregate dormitories in schools, we segregate prisons for good reasons. So on those occasions, my rights depend on being able to recognise and act on the sex of everybody else. In other situations, I don't care what they think about their sex. They can say what they like.
Right, and it seems in order to, at least from my reading, it seems in order to confuse people and get away with some of this stuff, they use gender in place of sex. And I'm wondering how some people say, well, gender just doesn't even exist at all. It's a useless term. How do you think about gender?
I do think it's a useless term, but not because there aren't things that it could mean, but because it's so ambiguous. Like, Americans do seem to be very squeamish about saying the word sex. I think you're afraid that we're all talking about sexy sex, as in sexual intercourse, all the time. So you tend to say gender, and you say it in your laws when you mean sex. I mean, that happens a bit in England as well, but we're much less squeamish about the word sex than Americans seem to be. So that's one meaning of it. And another meaning is in a lot of feminist theory, gender is the societal thing that gets imposed upon people because of their sex. So the famous opening line of Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, is one is not born but becomes a woman. And that process of being socialised into being a woman, being told that you mustn't take up too much space, you must be pretty, you must be, secondary to men's considerations, you could call that gender if you wanted. And then there's this more recent meaning, gender identity, which is some posited inner sense that you are male or female. And that's taken to have nothing to do with your body. There's no evidence whatsoever that most people feel that they have a gender identity. It's most people just look down, recognise the sex that they are, and never question that again. But the occasional person does feel very uncomfortable with their sexed body. And this theory of gender identity has grown up as an explanatory theory for why those people might feel like that. When there's no need for any such theory, there are other reasons why people might feel dissociated from or unhappy about their sex.
Right. Yeah, so obviously your life has taken a big turn when encountering this topic and just these deranged beliefs, but there are still a lot of people, well, there are some people whom this doesn't affect, but in general it seems to affect a lot of people, a lot of families, a lot of women. But for those who, I don't know, live in middle America or just not online as much, and they dismiss this as not a real problem, what would you say to those kinds of people?
I think one of the reasons that all of this has got so far is that it's so crazy it doesn't sound like anyone could possibly think it. So when I started saying to people, they are telling children that sex is a spectrum. They're telling 4, 5, 6-year-olds that they were assigned a sex at birth, but that was just a guess that the medical professionals guessed, and they're waiting for that child to tell us whether they're male or female. People would think like she has to be exaggerating, she's misunderstood something. They're not really saying that. Strangely, if they had been a bit less bizarre in what they were saying, we might have caught on to it sooner. I know it was very hard to get editors, as a journalist, it was very hard to get editors keen on this because they just thought it was too mad. And then also this is a topic where false analogies keep coming up. So one of them is with race. People say that a woman who doesn't want a trans woman in her spaces, remember that a trans woman is a man, is like a white woman who doesn't want a black woman in her spaces. And that's obviously just not a sensible analogy, but that analogy is used. And another one is with sexual orientation. So people think that if you're anti-trans, it's like being anti-gay. But you can be as supportive of gay rights as you like or not, but the fact is it just basically doesn't affect you if you are not gay yourself. Gay people get together, that's fine, it's not your business. But this is your business because you can't have single-sex spaces if the opposite sex can identify themselves into them. It takes away something that everybody has. So I suppose what I'd say to people if they think this isn't important is first, okay, it isn't important, it's stupid. It's very stupid. We're wasting our time on this. We should stop saying stupid things like that male and female aren't real and get on with actually trying to improve the world for everybody and improve healthcare for everybody, including people who don't like their sexed bodies. But sadly, we can't do that. This has become embedded. It's been really taken on by our institutions. Healthcare, especially in America, has become infested with this thinking. And it's really harming people. You may not care about women's sports, but I think that's a bit mean of you if you don't. I don't see why women can't have fair competition, the same as men do. But now men can identify into women's events, and men are much stronger and faster, so that's not fair. I think everybody should care about children and children's well-being, and children are just routinely being misled and told lies in schools. And those lies are genuinely affecting children's mental health, their happiness, their ideas about what it is to be a boy or a girl, what it means to be gender non-conforming, in ways that are going to have significant impacts for this entire generation for the rest of their lives. It's too late to stop it now. All we can do is try and limit the length of time this goes on before we realise that this is a serious, serious medical and social scandal. So, yeah, wake up. I know it sounds mad. I know it's stupid, but it's there. It's happening. It's in your children's school. It's in your community. And you have to fight it because if you don't, it'll just spread. Right.
So I know from reading Irreversible Damage and other works that there's been quite an influx of girls being referred to gender clinics and wanting to transition in groups and really wanting to identify out of being a woman. And I'm wondering, if you don't know, it's fine, but do you happen to know the stats around that in the UK in terms of like when that started happening, when the influx started to occur?
So one of the good things about being in the UK from this point, for the point of view of this phenomenon, is that there's a National Health Service and there's a single gender clinic that serves all of England and Wales. So you can look at the referrals to that and it tells you something about the spread of this phenomenon. I think they've been accepting children since sometime in the 1970s, but the first year there were 2 and they were both little boys. And it kept being like that, just a very small number, almost all little boys, almost all these highly effeminate little boys that if you read the research properly, you understand are just rather likely to grow up to be gay. And these particular sorts of kids can be misled into thinking early on that their gender nonconformity means they were meant to be girls. But if you leave these poor little kids alone and you support them and you don't bully them, puberty hits and they realise, oh, I'm different for a reason, and that's fine. So that's how it trundled along. And then around 2010, the numbers started to pick up and they started to see more girls. And then 2015 was really an inflection point. And they started to see really a lot of girls. I think the figures went up by 4,000% in a decade. There's still a few thousand. It's not an enormous number in a country the size of England. But these are the ones who actually make it to the National Gender Clinic. That does not count the many people who don't see a doctor or who see their local family doctor only. But 2015 was when this stuff was being pumped out, in particular on Tumblr, big time. And it's also, I think, the year, it's either the exact year or nearly the year when Tumblr had to stop having what's called pro-ana material, so anorexic material glorifying anorexia. They did that for a long time and they really spread eating disorders. And then they stopped because there was such a fuss about it. And the whole thing just went into talking about gender instead. Like, what is your gender identity? Have you examined your gender identity? It's very important to know exactly what your gender identity is. And then I think 2015 or 2016, the BBC, the UK's national broadcaster, put out a show called I Am Leo, in which they showed a girl who identified as a boy. And it was propaganda. It was absolute propaganda. They literally had pictures of what were meant to be a boy and a girl, pink and blue. And the pink child had a blue brain, and the blue child had a pink brain. And they were really saying, a child could be born in the wrong body. It was possible to have a pink brain in a blue body. And that was just, it was like they had broadcast pro-anorexia propaganda. And that really put rocket fuel under it. And since then, we've just seen a very big increase in teenage girls.
Right. There's a few different ways I can go, because I'm interested in talking about the phenomenon and how it affects boys too, because that seems to be not talked about enough. But
yeah, I agree.
But real quick, this idea that I've seen videos where people claim that, this is scientifically proven. A boy can have a brain that's structurally or anatomically or chemically or whatever the reasoning is more like a girl's and vice versa, and that explains this transgender phenomenon. What would you say to someone who thinks that there is scientific evidence showing that that's the case?
So anything that happens in our behaviour or in our feelings is just by definition going to have a correlate in our brains. That's where our thinking is done, and it's what directs our feelings. So if somebody has a severe feeling of dissociation from their sex, in principle, one would imagine that you'd be able to see that in a detailed enough brain scan if we understood brains enough. But that doesn't mean that that person has a brain of the opposite sex. We would be able to see anorexia in people's brains too. We would be able to see, anger, all those sorts of things. We're not at that level, but, I just mean in principle, it has to be in your brain. We do know that there are small but non-random differences between straight people's brains and gay people's brains, at least among men. So again, it's possible that there are small brain differences that direct people or make it more likely, make them more prone to feel this dissociation with their sex. That's true for schizophrenia. That's you've probably got a genetic predisposition that may in part be because of your brain architecture. But none of this means that you are the other sex. We are able to look at brain scans and tell with an awful lot more than random chance whether they're male or female brains. I think it's like 90-something% accuracy. But with faces, we're close to 100% accuracy. And with genitals, we're basically at 100% accuracy. So why would we look at brain scans? If somebody's a man, they're a man. If their brain is a bit unusual for a man, okay, it's an unusual brain for a man. It just doesn't mean that they have the opposite sex brain. This is just a bizarre concept.
Right, and even if there was even a little bit more truth to that, doing these medicalizing children or other people and doing these sex change operations doesn't guarantee that they would not feel the disassociation anymore, right?
I mean, imagine that it was the case that you could have a brain that was totally typical for a woman inside a man's body. It still wouldn't follow that you should do surgery on that person's body to try to make it look more like a woman's, because we're very, very far from being able to change the sex of a body. Like, every cell in your body is the sex that you are. Like, you can get a tiny scrap of skin and be able to tell what sex somebody is. It affects like 10,000 things in your body, everything about the way your blood is, the way your digestive system works, the thickness of your skin. All these things are influenced. Your brain, your bones, your muscles, these things are all influenced by your sex. We can do just a few small things. Like, we can give you hormones. So if you're a man, you could take estrogen. If you're a woman, you could take testosterone. You can cut things off or have implants. So a woman can remove her breasts, a man can have breast implants. You can try to turn the genitals into something that looks more like the other sex, which is not a very effective thing to do, because it's an entire system. Like, anyone who's thought about the function of genitals in any way that goes beyond a sort of childish bloody Mr. Potato Head way would realise you cannot take a man's genitals and turn them into something that's like a woman's genitals, or vice versa. Like, this is just not going to be a very effective operation. So even if you had this hypothetical male body with a female brain in it, you can't give that person a female body. You just can't do it. It'd be kinder to say, this is not possible. Like, I suppose very occasionally you might still have an adult who would prefer to do the cosmetic surgery. But I mean, it still just doesn't make them a woman. And it isn't going to make them look like a woman either to most women. Because they're going to be taller, they're going to have deeper voices, they're going to have beards, they're going to have all those things that testosterone gives male people during puberty. And those things are irreversible.
Right. I want to come back to what some of the reasons are that girls might want to identify out of womanhood. But before we do, I want to talk about boys, young men and boys for a moment, and just highlight the fact that some people think this maybe is only happening with young girls, and there's the social contagion aspect. But with boys, do you think that this gender distress, do you think it manifests a little bit differently? And two, do you think that maybe it's underreported, how many boys are wanting to transition and go this route?
So there's lots of different reasons that people might suffer gender dysphoria, which is this discomfort or disease with the sex of their bodies. And they're different for males and females. So classically, if you go back some decades, what gender clinics saw was mostly males, and it was mostly either little boys who were very effeminate little boys who had interpreted their effeminacy as meaning that they were meant to be girls and had become very distressed by the fact that they weren't girls. And as I said, if you support those boys, support their families not to be homophobic and not to bully them, they'll just grow up probably gay and happy enough. They won't continue to be gender dysphoric. Then there's a much stranger phenomenon, which is older men. It's very puzzling that they say that they've got a woman inside, because they don't seem at all womanly usually. They're quite hard-charging men often. And those men, the theory is, and there's a lot of evidence for this theory, even though internet, Twitter and the rest would tell you it doesn't exist, but if you just go and look at the self-published stuff on Amazon and elsewhere, it exists. And that's a phenomenon that's called autogynephilia, which is this sexual desire that a man has for himself in the image of a woman. And it can just, over the years, it can become so overpowering that this man decides to transition, even though he's a heterosexual man and not at all feminine and unlikely to pass at all. But it's just become the erotic fixation that rules his life. So that's men. Women were seen much less at gender clinics, and it was mostly very butch lesbians who just actually sometimes passed pretty well as men and just found it impossible to move around the world without basically being taken as men. And they just wanted to take some testosterone, have a double mastectomy, and vanish off into the world as men. And then along came the internet and changed everything in every respect, especially for children and teenagers. And young girls, teenage girls, who had not been seen by gender clinics before this. Like, before 2010, I don't think there was a single academic paper that mentioned teenage girls as ever suffering gender dysphoria. Those teenage girls started to come up in quite large numbers, and then very large numbers, and now around the world they're the largest group that present with gender dysphoria. So you ask yourself, what's happening here? Well, teenage girls are the group that are most likely to experience social contagion of all sorts. But also, they're a group that have been affected in very particular ways by the internet, and in particular by the rise of online porn and by the just sexualization of everything. Like, I often think when I walk past a secondary school and I look at the girls coming out, there's the girls who look like they're getting ready to do Instagram as a sort of an influencer. Like really quite young girls, 15, 16, who've got lip fillers and, have like very dramatic eyebrows and fake tan, and they're tottering around in heels. And then there's the girls who are the alternate girls who've got cropped hair and have opted out of this game. And I bet you most of them call themselves non-binary or she-they or, demi-boy or some novel gender identity. And it's like the idea of what a girl is has become so narrow and so constraining, so much more so than when I was a girl in the 1970s and 80s, that like unless you're the perfect girl, like unless you've got, nail extensions and hair extensions and you can walk in heels, you're not even a girl. So you're going to have to call yourself something else. And then when you think what teenagers see in the way of porn and what the girls read and write on fanfic websites, it is hyper explicit and often quite violent and degrading towards women. So I heard again and again, and Abigail Schreier in her book Irreversible Damage heard this a lot too, girls saying that, they either saw or they heard their male classmates talking about online porn and the choking and the spitting and the anal and the throttling and the hitting, and just thought like, I am out. If that's what a woman is, I don't want any of it. But it doesn't seem to be acceptable to just say, that's all grotesque. That's not what woman means to me. It seems to be that you have to say, I am not a woman. And then the boys, like the internet and computer games and so on has hugely affected boys as well. I mean, I can't say that all boys think this is great either. Like, how are you meant to be this sort of stud who treats women like this? Like, maybe you don't want to do that either. And the boys who are on the autistic spectrum in particular, may feel that their discomfort with their own body. Like if you look up online now as a teenager, why do I feel so ill at ease with myself? Why do I feel like I don't fit in? Why am I not like other boys? You'll be told it's because you're trans. That's the first answer you will get on if you go to Reddit or any of those. They will absolutely groom you into thinking this. And, it seems to be the explanation that answers everything, and it also gives you a chance for a totally new identity. You can leave behind the self that you maybe feel has failed or is not popular, and you can be reborn. Like if you look at the names that people give themselves when they transition, surprisingly often it's names like Neo and Phoenix. They're even saying, I am a new person. So that affects boys too. And boys who play computer games are very used to taking on avatars and to changing the features of the avatars. And they may be very dissociated from their physical selves, very much prone to being in their heads and on screens. So I think that there's a new presentation for teenage boys. And then, of course, some of them, it is the porn. Like some of the porn is really, it's transgender porn. It's either drawings or actually physical bodies or descriptions of people who have both a penis and breasts. And there's a whole genre called forced feminization, in which the eroticism is about being forced to appear like a girl. And, I can't imagine finding this sexy, but I also think that there are people who this would never have occurred to them in an entire lifetime, but they stumble on it online and now it's their fixation.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and one of the unfortunate downsides of the internet. Yeah. And that was something I was talking about with Stella, this idea, which apparently she's written some books about, but of helicopter parenting, kind of keeping kids indoors, and then the internet happens, and then smartphones happen, and then kids are just so online, and it's certainly concerning to me. And I think, I guess my question in there is, do you think if we encourage a little bit more freedom for kids to play outside, to be embodied in their physical bodies more, to get off the internet, do you think we would see at least something of a decline of this trans identification?